Hello everyone, I am Riley Dell, and today I will be discussing one of the most defining and turbulent periods in American history, the events leading up to the American Civil War. In the early 19th century, the United States faced growing divisions between the North and South, not just over economic and social differences, but over the deeply contentious issue of slavery. These divisions, though rooted in the nation's founding, were exacerbated by a series of events that brought the North and South into direct conflict, ultimately resulting in a succession of Southern states and the outbreak of war in 1861. From the Missouri Compromise to the Dred Scott decision, each of these events played a crucial role in shaping the path to war. Today, I will explore how these events led to the breakdown of relations between the North and South, setting the stage for one of the most pivotal conflicts in American history. Now, before I discuss the Missouri Compromise of 1820, I'd like to discuss the relationship between the North and South, as the issues surrounding slavery can be seen since the colonial days of America, especially in its economy. In the North, the economy was primarily industrial and commercial, with a focus on manufacturing and trade and small-scale farming. This region's population was growing rapidly, and there was increased support for abolitionism, driven both by moral opposition to slavery and economic factors, such as the rise of wage labor. As a result, many northern states had already abolished slavery or were moving towards gradual emancipation. In contrast, the southern economy was deeply dependent on agriculture, particularly the cultivation of cash crops like cotton and tobacco, which required manual labor. Thus, slavery was not only central to the southern economy, but also embedded in its social hierarchy. Although both regions were part of the same nation, their contrasting economic interest and view on slavery were the beginning to creating the tension. The first event was that of the Missouri Compromise. In 1819, Missouri, which was part of the Louisiana Territory, applied for admission to the Union. At the same time, there was 11 free states and 11 slave states. The admission of Missouri as a slave state would upset this balance, potentially giving the South greater power in the Senate. In response, Northern lawmakers rallied for emancipation in the territory. To resolve this growing crisis, Henry Clay brokered a deal of the Missouri Compromise, which achieved three main things: that Missouri was admitted into the Union as a slave state, Maine was admitted as a free state, maintaining the balance between free and slave states, and a geographical line of the 36th degree and 30th parallel was drawn across the Louisiana Territory, with slavery prohibited in any new states or territories north of this line, except for Missouri. Although it provided short-term relief, it foreshadowed the future conflicts as the question of slavery's expansion would continue to be a major issue in American politics. The nullification crisis was a political confrontation between the federal government and the state of South Carolina in the early 1830s. Centered around the issue of state rights, it was sparked by the passage of tariffs of 1828 and 1832, which South Carolina and other southern states felt were economically harmful for their agricultural economies. The tariff of 1828 was designed to protect northern manufacturers by imposing high duties on imported goods. This led to higher prices of manufactured goods in the South, which relied upon imported goods. John C. Calhoun, the vice president under Andrew Jackson, advocated for the idea of nullification. He argued that the states had a right to nullify federal laws they believed were unconstitutional, a concept based on the idea that the federal government was a creation of the states and that each state had the authority to decide whether a federal law was valid within its own borders. As a result, South Carolina threatened to secede from the Union if the federal government attempted to enforce the tariffs. The crisis was resolved through a compromise brokered by Henry Clay of the Tariff Compromise of 1833. The nullification crisis was a crucial moment in the ongoing debate between state rights and federal power. While the immediate conflict was resolved, The crisis laid the groundwork for future tensions, especially in the years leading up to the Civil War, when Southern states would again invoke state rights as a justification for secession. Texas had been part of Mexico until 1836, when it declared its independence following the Texas Revolution. For nearly a decade, Texas existed as an independent republic, but was heavily reliant on slavery for its agricultural economy. Texas applied for annexation to the United States, but faced resistance particularly from northern states who were opposed to the expansion of slavery, as adding Texas would upset the delicate balance of power in the United States. In December of 1845, the U.S. Congress approved the annexation of Texas, and Texas officially became the 28th state. The annexation of Texas had profound effects upon the relations of the North and South, exacerbating existing tensions over slavery and territorial expansion. Its admission to the Union tipped the balance of power in the favor of the South, and heightened fears in the North of a slave power conspiracy in which Southern interests would dominate national politics. The annexation of Texas also led directly to the outbreak of the Mexican-American War. This war resulted in the U.S. gaining vast territories and raised new questions whether these newly acquired territories would permit slavery, further deepening North and South division. The Compromise of 1850 was a series of 5 legislation measures passed by U.S. Congress in an effort to resolve tension between the North and South over slavery and territorial expansion. The Compromise did the following. It admitted California as a free state. The territories of New Mexico and Utah were created from the lands acquired through the Mexican-American War. The passing of the Fugitive Slave Act mandated the return of slaves that were within Northern Territory, and it abolished the slave trade in the capital of D.C. The Compromise of 1850 was seen as a temporary solution to sectional conflicts over slavery, but it did little to resolve the deeper issues between the North and South. The use of popular sovereignty for New Mexico and Utah territories left the issue of slavery open to future conflict, which was demonstrated by the later violent and political turmoil in Kansas, also known as Bleeding Kansas, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces fought for control of the territory. One of the most controversial provisions of the Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act, in particular, as it further alienated many Northerns and increased abolitionist sentiment, making the national divide over slavery even more pronounced. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which was designed by Senator Stephen A. Douglas to organize the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. This act allowed settlers of each territory to decide for themselves, through popular sovereignty, whether to permit slavery. This effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had prohibited slavery north of the 36th-degree 30th parallel. The Kansas-Nebraska Act ignited tensions between the North and South, as it opened the possibility for slavery to expand into areas that had previously been free of slavery. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups rushed to Kansas in an attempt to influence the outcome of the vote on slavery, resulting in violent clashes between the two factions. Eventually, Kansas was admitted to the Union as a free state in 1861, after years of violence and political turmoil. The North and South both saw the conflict as part of a broader struggle over the future of slavery in America, and the bloodshed in Kansas was a precursor to the sectional violence that would later engulf the entire nation during the Civil War. Dred Scott was an enslaved African American who had been taken by his owner, Dr. John Emerson, from a slave state of Missouri to a free state of Illinois, and later the Wisconsin Territory, which was also a free under the Missouri Compromise. After returning to Missouri, Scott sued for his freedom, arguing that because he had lived in a free territory, he should be considered free. The court ruled that Dred Scott, as an African American, was not a U.S. citizen and therefore had no right to sue in federal court. The court also ruled that the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had prohibited slavery in certain northern territories, was unconstitutional. This decision reinforced the legal status of slavery, asserting that enslaved people were property. This led to the Northern outrage, as many saw the ruling as an attempt by Southern-dominated Supreme Court to nationalize slavery and undermine efforts to limit its expansion. The Dred Scott case further divided in the nation between the North and South, fueling the fear and resentment over the issue of slavery. In 1858, Illinois held election for its U.S. Senate seat. Abraham Lincoln, a relatively unknown politician at the time but a rising star in the newly formed Republican Party, challenged Douglas for the Senate seat. The two men were very different in their political views, and their debate became a stage for the larger national conflict over slavery. A key piece from the debate that would foreshadow the events of the Civil War was that of Lincoln arguing that the nation could not continue to exist half-slave states and half-free. Although Lincoln lost the Senate race to Douglas, it brought the issue of slavery to the forefront of American politics and set the stage for Lincoln to become President of the United States. John Brown was an ardent abolitionist who believed in using violence, if necessary, to overthrow slavery. He had already gained attention for his role in Bleeding Kansas, where he and his followers killed pro-slavery settlers. Brown's plan for Harper's Ferry was to strike a major blow against slavery by capturing an arsenal at Harper's Ferry, which stored weapons and ammunition. He hoped that by arming enslaved people, he could spark a wider slave rebellion in the South. John Brown and several of his men were captured, and on December 2nd of 1859, Brown was executed by hanging in Charlestown, Virginia. His death made him a martyr for the abolitionist cause in the North, and tensed the political situation in the United States. As in the South, it led to calls for stronger laws to protect slavery, and it fueled the growing fear of abolitionist conspiracies. The election of Abraham Lincoln as the 16th President of the United States was the final nail in the coffin for rectifying the division between the North and South. Abraham Lincoln, a member of the anti-slavery Republican Party, was seen as a direct threat to the institution of slavery in the South. Many in the South saw Lincoln's election as a step towards the eventual abolition of slavery, which they believed would destroy their economy and social order. In fact, Lincoln's election was extra surprising to the South, as Lincoln did not appear on the ballot in 10 southern states. Lincoln's election marked the course of the Civil War that fundamentally reshaped the United States. The succession of southern states from the Union in 1860 and 1861 had profound and immediate impacts on the relationships between the states, both within the South and with the North. The decision of southern states to succeed and form the Confederate States of America was a direct result of tensions over slavery and state rights that had been building up for over decades. Several states also publicly declared their support for the institution of slavery, further emphasizing the ideological divide between the North and South and deepening the nation's divisions. In examining the events leading up to the American Civil War, it becomes clear that the escalating tensions between the North and South were not just a result of individual conflicts, but years of political, economic, and social divisions that could no longer be reconciled. From the Missouri Compromise and the annexation of Texas to the Dred Scott decision and John Brown's raid, each event contributed to a growing sense of fear mistrust, and opposition between the two regions. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was the final tipping point, as it revealed the irreconcilable differences between the North and the South.